Why you keep putting it off, the truth about procrastination. Welcome to today's masterclass on procrastination. Why you keep putting it off, the truth about procrastination. You might be here today because you keep procrastinating over a different conversation you know needs to happen, but cannot seem to begin. You might be here because there is a major decision you have been sitting with for weeks without being able to commit to. You might be here because you keep deferring work you know you should delegate, but somehow never do. You might be here because there's a project that's been on your list for 6 months that you have started and abandoned more than once. You might be here today because you find it easy to make progress on other people's priorities, but not your own. You might be here because you sit down and intend to tackle a hard thing and find yourself doing 7 other things instead. You might be here because the thing you keep not starting is the thing that matters most to you personally. You might be here because you have tried the diary block, the early morning, the accountability partner, and the thing is still there. Does any of this resonate? Does any of this sound familiar? You're in the right place if you want to understand not just what to do about procrastination, but why it is happening in the first place. You're in the right place if the standard explanations, laziness, poor discipline, lack of motivation have never quite rung true for you. You're in the right place if you're a capable, experienced person who gets things done, and yet there is a specific category of task you keep not starting. Imagine if you understood exactly what your brain is doing when initiative fails to arrive. Imagine if the explanation had nothing to do with weakness or laziness, and everything to do with the mechanism you can actually work with. Imagine if the thing you keep not starting finally became something you could approach differently. If that is what you're looking for, you are in exactly the right place. Why procrastination is not what most people think it is. What the brain is actually doing when initiative disappears. Why the standard solutions fail to reach the mechanism. The identity lay underneath the pattern. What actually changes it. Those are all the things we're covering here. By the end, you'll have a different way of reading what is happening and a clearer sense of what to do about it. This masterclass runs for approximately 1 hour. I'll take questions at the end, and at the end have something for you. A small number of gifted sessions available to people who stay until the close. I'll tell you more when we get there. So my name's Charles Whitaker. I work as an executive coach. I've been working with senior leaders and executives for approximately 18 years. I work one-to-one with clients exclusively over Zoom. This makes me accessible, avoids travel, and being outside any organizational setting enhances the privacy this kind of work requires. I help leaders explore how the weight of responsibility impacts not only their work, but also themselves, so they can become more effective and lead a fuller, more satisfying life. 3 books sit behind the work I describe in this session. The Inner Life of Leadership Pressure, written for men in senior roles under sustained demand. Finding Your Bearings, written for men over 50, navigating the shift when the structures that define them begin to change. And The Ground You Stand On, written for younger men at the start of their working lives. In a previous life, I spent over 20 years in manufacturing in senior leadership positions. I know pressure from the inside. I know what it is to carry significant responsibility over a long period without adequate recovery. I've stood at thresholds, alone, uncertain, having to find my bearings more than once. I built this work from the inside of that experience, not from the outside looking in. I also have a PhD from university. The word itself. I want to start with the word itself, procrastination. Has roots in Latin, pro for forward and crastinus belonging to tomorrow. Literally to put forward to tomorrow. A neutral description of a timing decision. When the word entered English in the late 16th century, it carried very little moral weight. It described an action, not a perceived character flaw. Simply, this thing moves to tomorrow. And for much of history, deliberate delay was not just neutral, it is considered wise. The Protestant work ethic and the Industrial Revolution changed the relationship between time and moral standing. Time became economic. An hour unspent was now wasted. Output became the measure of a person's value. Procrastination moved from a timing decision to a character defect. And that is where it has largely stayed. Many of the men I work with carry it, often silently, as a form of quiet shame. I know what I should be doing. I'm not doing it. What is wrong with me? Let me challenge that. Not by telling you that procrastination doesn't matter. It does, and we'll get into that. But by showing you that the explanation most people carry is wrong. And the wrong explanation produces the wrong solution. What it is not. Before we get to what procrastination actually is, it is worth spending a moment on what it is not, because the wrong explanations are doing a lot of damage. It is not laziness. Laziness, properly understood, is a preference for inactivity over activity. The men I work with are not inactive. They are, in most cases, extraordinarily active. They carry significant responsibility. They make hundreds of decisions. They deal with complexity that would stop most people in their tracks. Laziness is not in play. It is not poor time management. Time management is a skill that involves organising available time to match task windows. The men I work with have been managing demanding schedules for decades. They know how to manage time. If the problem with time management, they would have solved it by now. And my own view is that there's no such thing as time management. There's only managing ourselves in the time available. And that is a very different problem. It is not lack of motivation. One is closer to something real, but the standard interpretation is wrong. Lack of motivation is usually framed as a fuel problem. You want to need it more, feel it more, find your passion, reconnect with your why. None of that touches what is actually happening. We will come back to motivation shortly and reframe it entirely. It is not lack of discipline. Discipline is a capacity to sustain effort over time. The man who keeps not starting the thing on his list often has enormous discipline in other areas applied to other things. Discipline is not what is missing. So, if it is none of those things, what is it? I need to introduce you to a principle that once you have it, changes the way you interpret almost everything we will discuss. Your brain is a prediction machine. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of how the brain actually operates, supported by decades of neuroscience, work by Lisa Feldman Barrett, Carl Friston, Andy Clark, and others. The brain does not passively receive information and then respond. It predicts. Before the next moment arrives, the brain has already constructed its best guess about what that moment will contain, what it will require, and what the appropriate response is. This is extraordinarily useful. It is what allows the leader to think ahead, to model how a conversation might go before it happens, to do real-time error correction, to see 3 moves into a decision before committing to the first one. The predictive brain is the strategic brain. And it's worth saying clearly, this capacity is not diminished. Elizabethan audiences sat through 5-hour performances of Shakespeare. Lincoln and his rivals debated for 7 hours at a stretch. The ability to sustain deep concentration is not something human beings have lost. It is something the current environment makes very expensive to access. That is a different problem, and it has a different solution. The brain does not just predict events, it predicts costs. It is running what we might call a body budget, a continuous calculation of what resources are available, what is likely to be needed. Energy, attention, initiative. These are finite. The brain is constantly deciding how much to spend and where, and it updates that budget based on evidence. So this is a model of how it might look. The evidence arrives, and based on the evidence, the brain then predicts the cost. In line with that, the body budget adjusts, and then as a result of that, the initiative is withheld. So the brain is not failing, it is calculating accurately from available evidence. The conventional question is, why are you not taking action? A more useful question is, what prediction is the brain protecting? You cannot change the behavior without changing the prediction. You can only change the prediction by changing the evidence. When a man has spent months, in many cases years, in an environment where starting something more often than not leads to more demand, when engagement does not lead to completion but to more engagement, where he gets to the end of most days having dealt with things rather than finished things, where the inbox never empties, the decisions keep arriving, the expectations keep accumulating. Our brains learn from that. The brain reads that evidence and it draws a conclusion. Starting is expensive. Starting opens more than it closes. Engagement leads to more demand, not less. And so, as a rational protective response to an accurate prediction, the brain begins to withhold the resource that would have launched the initiative. It does not do this as a punishment. It does not do it because you are weak. It does it because that is what a well-functioning prediction system does, when the evidence consistently points one way. That is what most of us experience as procrastination. Not laziness, not weakness. What happens next is that the brain is making a calculation based on the evidence available to it and deciding, correctly given what it knows, that starting is likely to cost more than it returns. Let that land for a moment, as it reframes the whole thing. There's one more dimension to this I want to bring in, because it explains something the basic prediction model does not quite reach. Friston's work on active inference suggests that the brain is not just predicting outcomes, it is also predicting models. Not just predicting what will happen if you start a task, but predicting a picture of who you are. When the task in front of you carries a possible implication about your competence, your adequacy, your identity, the brain's calculation is no longer purely about the task. It's about what completing or failing at the task might reveal. The result is that most intelligent, most capable people often procrastinate hardest on exactly the things that matter most to them. Not because those things are most difficult in technical terms, but because those things carry the highest identity stakes. The book, the creative project, the venture that is genuinely theirs, the conversation that requires them to be known rather than to perform. The conventional question about procrastination is, why are you not taking action? The more useful question is, what prediction is the brain protecting? What prediction is the brain protecting? Motivation is a prediction. This is bringing us to motivation. I want to reframe it completely. The motivation is commonly described as a feeling, something you have or do not have, something you need to cultivate, sustain, or rediscover. Self-help literature treats motivation as a resource that needs to be topped up. You often hear it described in terms of moving away from something painful or towards something desirable. Motivation is either a push or a pull. Run from the burning platform or be drawn toward the better future. That framing has some truth in it, but it misses the deeper mechanism. And there's also a related trap with naming. Research consistently shows that vividly imagining the end result can actually make you less likely to do the work, not more. The emotional reward is partly consumed by the fantasy. The brain registers something like satisfaction before the task has begun, and the urgency to start quietly drops. This is why vision boards and outcome visualization often produce the opposite of what they promise. Imagining the destination does not move you toward it. Rehearsing the specific steps does, because the steps become real, and real things can be begun. Motivation is a prediction. Before committing resource to any action, the brain asks, if I start this, will it lead somewhere? Will it lead to closure, to completion, to something resolved? If the prediction is yes, the brain releases the resource. You feel what we call motivation. If the prediction is no, the brain withholds the resource. You do not feel motivated, not because something is wrong with you, because the brain has learned not to invest in a return that rarely materializes. Just make yourself do it. This addresses the behavior without touching the prediction. The prediction has not changed. Tomorrow the same calculation will produce the same result. Find your why. This attempts to override the prediction with emotional fuel. Simon Sinek built a significant body of work on this idea. It's compelling, and it's not wrong. Purpose matters. But it is working at the level of feeling, and the prediction model does not update on feeling, it updates on evidence. The man who knows exactly why he wants to write the book, who can articulate it clearly and feels it genuinely, and still cannot start, he has already found his why. That is not what is missing. Build better habits. Habits are useful, but a habit built on top of a prediction model that says starting is expensive will be fragile. The more pressure increases, the prediction wins. You cannot talk your way out of a prediction. You cannot discipline your way past it. You can only change it by changing the evidence. Open loops and the space problem. There's a second layer to this, and it compounds the first. I use the phrase open loops to describe anything in your mind that is unresolved, unfinished, or awaiting action. An unanswered email you're not sure how to handle. A decision you've been meaning to make. A conversation that needs to happen and has not. A task half completed. A commitment made and not yet acted on. David Allen used this phrase, getting things done, to describe unfinished items that the mind keeps tracking. The insight is simple, but its implications run deep. Your mind does not store these passively. It returns to them, checks on them, rehearses possible actions, considers consequences, runs scenarios, not because you constantly decide to think about them, because the brain treats unresolved items as active, and active items require resource, attention, cognitive space, background processing. Individually, each loop is manageable, but they accumulate. As they accumulate, the space available for new, spacious, creative, self-directed thinking narrows. Not because your capacity has diminished, it has not, but because that capacity is already occupied. This is why you keep meaning to start often stays unstarted, even on the days when you technically have time. It is not the time that is missing, it is the space. A man sitting down with an hour free, carrying 40 open loops, does not have an hour of available thinking. He has 40 claims on his attention, each drawing something from the pool. And whatever is left over is what he's actually trying to work with. For most men in demanding roles, that remainder is considerably smaller than they assume. So this conveys that pictorially. So on the left we have what the mind is holding on to, and on the right we have the available space, which as we go down from top to bottom diminishes to represent what is happening as we carry more and more. So simplicity on the left is that we have an email we're not sure how to handle. We still have full capacity, but by the time we add another layer into that decision, then we start to use up some of our cognitive space. Then a conversation is still to happen. It takes up more. A task half completed. A commit not yet acted on. All the other things still open. All of these things are stacking up on top of one another and taking up that available space we have for clear, productive thinking. The kind of task that tends to be procrastinated, the meaningful one, the personal one, the one that matters, tends to require the most space. It is often not a task you can complete on autopilot. It requires genuine presence, genuine attention, the part of you that is not already committed elsewhere. That is precisely what is least available. So why do loops stay open? Understanding open loops leads to a natural question. Why do capable, decisive people let them accumulate in the first place? There are several patterns worth recognizing because most men I work with see themselves in more than one. Some loops stay open because good enough feels like a threat. Perfectionism at its root is a strategy for managing the fear of judgment. If the work is not finished, it cannot be assessed. It exists in an intermediate state where its quality is still undefined, which means the person's adequacy is still undefined. Completing something collapses that possibility space. It turns, I might be excellent at this, into a result that can be scrutinized. For many men who have built their identity on competence, that closure is not relief, it's exposure. So the email is drafted and redrafted. The presentation is refined past the point of improvement. Not because the extra attention genuinely helps, but because staying in the loop feels safer than stepping out of it. For some men, availability is not just behavior, it is who they are. The person who responds quickly, the person who never drops the ball, the person who is always on. Closing the loops through delegation or saying no feels like a threat to the self-image that's built over years. So the loop stays open, because closing it the right way by releasing it feels wrong. Many leaders carry an unconscious belief that finishing something prematurely is riskier than leaving it open. The open loop feels like insurance. If it is still live, I can still influence it. There's a deep logic to this, particularly in complex high-stakes environments, but it becomes a trap. The insurance policy can cost more than the risk it is covering. And then there is the pattern that underlies the others. The man is carrying so much that starting anything new, even something he once has taught, feels like adding to an already overwhelming load. The loops have accumulated to the point where the cost of beginning anything at all has become prohibitive. This is not avoidance in the usual sense. It is a system in genuine overload. The deepest pattern across all of these is this. In each case, loops stay open not because the work requires it, but because the man's sense of who he is requires it. And that's worth sitting with. I want to go deeper now, because this is where the conversation about procrastination usually stops, and it should not. When I look at what the men I work with keep not starting, there's a pattern in the content of what stays undone. It's not random. It's not simply the hardest of tasks or the most complex ones. There's a specific category. The thing he keeps not starting is often the thing that is most his. Not the operational task with a deadline, not the decision that serves someone else's agenda, not the request that arrives in his inbox and belongs to someone else's priority. Those things get done. The things that stay undone, the thing that stays undone is often the project he shows himself, the piece of writing, the creative work, the idea he has had for years that would require him to show up, not as his role, but as himself. The book, the business concept, the conversation he's beginning to have with his son, The course he keeps meaning to take that has nothing to do with his career. That category of thing. The cognitive load is real. The space problem is real. But for this particular category of tasks, they are not the whole story. There's a reason why that category stays unknown, and it runs deeper than time or capacity. Underneath the behaviour is a set of expectations that's been absorbed over years, not chosen consciously, absorbed. The expectations come with his role, his family position, his professional identity, the version of himself that other people need him to be. That version is available, reliable, productive, delivering. Does not disappear for self-directed projects. Does not spend Friday afternoons on creative work that serves no one's agenda but its own. Does not write the book while the business needs running. These are not rules anyone stated. Nobody sat him down and said, your personal projects are secondary, but the agreement was made, gradually, through the accumulation of small choices. Always taking the call, always putting the business first, always being the one who steps up. Each individual choice seemed entirely reasonable. Taken together, they added up to a contract. This is who you are now. This is what you do. The other things, the things that are yours, those can wait. The trouble is they've been waiting for 15 years. When he approaches a thing that is his own now, there is a quiet resistance that is not quite explicable by cognitive load or prediction mechanisms. To something closer to, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. That feeling is the contract asserting itself. The procrastination in this layer is not a failure of initiative, it's a form of compliance. He's being the person the expectations require him to be, rather than starting a thing that would require him to be someone else for a while. This matters because it's not solvable by changing the task management system. It is not solvable by waking up earlier. It requires a different kind of examination. Let me give you 3 pictures. This is a composite drawn from real experience, not any one single person. Taking the first, a senior leader in a manufacturing business, highly capable, has run complex operations for 20 years. On his list for 11 months is a financial modeler to allow him to have a different conversation with his investors. He knows how to build a model. He has the data. Every time he sits down to start, he deals with email for 90 minutes and then the day takes over. He generally does not understand why it has not happened. What's happening? His prediction model says that starting opens more. The brain has accurate evidence that initiating the task, this task leads to more demand. His mind is carrying 60 or 70 open items from the week. The space required is simply not available. It's occupied. This is the space problem and the prediction problem operating together, each reinforcing the other. Second one is a founder in his mid-50s. He's built something significant. On his list for 2 years is a book. Not a business book, a memoir. Something personal. He has notes, he has material. He's thought about it on long drives. He just cannot start. What's happening? The book would require him to be himself, not his role. The implicit contract says that it is not what he does. Every time he sits down to write, the contract activates, and he finds something more pressing to attend to. Not consciously. The resistance is not felt as resistance. It is felt as there are more important things to deal with first. There always are. That is the nature of the contract. The third man is a professional in his late 40s, technically excellent. On his list for 18 months is a conversation with his business partner about the future direction of the firm. Has rehearsed it many times in his head. He cannot begin it. What is happening? This is the wholly open to safer pattern combined with perfectionism, and the identity stakes are high. The conversation once started can go wrong. While it is still about to happen, it retains its ideal form. Starting it ends that possibility, and the prediction that starting will produce a result that he cannot fully control keeps it exactly where it is. 3 different men, 3 different flavors of the same mechanism. The task is not the problem. The prediction around the task is. You may have heard the phrase, the body keeps a score. It comes from a well-known book on trauma. I want to use it, but redirect it completely, because the framing I work from is different. And the difference matters. The body is not storing trauma. The body is not holding the past. What the body is doing, in the account I use, drawn from Lisa Feldman Barrett, is acting as the brain's scorecard. The heaviness in your chest when you think about the thing you've been avoiding. The vague unease on a Sunday evening. The flat, low energy feeling when you sit down at your desk on a day you had planned to tackle a hard thing. These are not memories stored in the body. They are being actively constructed by the brain right now based on its current predictions. The feelings are a cost signal. Before you've even begun, the body is presenting you with a predicted cost of starting. This is why the anticipation of the thing is often worse than the doing of it. The brain's prediction of the cost tends to overshoot the actual cost. But the prediction is what you encounter first. And for many men, the prediction is enough to redirect attention somewhere less costly. This also explains why attempting the avoided task on the wrong day is counterproductive. If the body budget is already low, if the week has been demanding, and recovery has been insufficient, the brain's prediction of the task cost will be even higher. The man who chooses Monday morning after a difficult weekend to finally tackle the thing he's been avoiding is also working against himself before he's even opened the laptop. I want to pause here and address something that comes up in almost every conversation I have with men about sustained pressure. Sleep. Many of the men I work with find it easier to discuss sleep than to discuss the things we've just been talking about. Sleep feels like a practical medical topic, and the problem is real. They cannot get off, or they wake in the early hours and cannot return, or they sleep a reasonable number of hours and awake feeling unrestored. The mechanism behind disrupted sleep, the mechanism we have been discussing throughout this session, are the same mechanism. The brain has learned to expect sustained demand, does not stand down easily. It does not have reliable evidence that stand down is safe, that the loops are genuinely closed, that the demand has genuinely paused. So it keeps the engine running, it keeps processing, it keeps checking. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense, it's a prediction problem. The brain predicts that demand will resume. It stays primed. I slept 8 hours but feel exhausted. That is a coherent statement. The hours were there, but the quality of processing was shaped by a brain running on a vigilant setting that was never quite turned off. When the pattern changes, when a man starts to build genuine evidence of completion, when the loops start to reduce rather than accumulate, the sleep tends to follow. Not immediately, but it moves. We've covered enough ground now to understand precisely why the approaches most people try do not work. Many of the men I work with have tried several of them and drawn the conclusion that they are the problem. They are not. The solutions were wrong for the problem. Discipline is an attempt to override the prediction through willpower. It can work briefly, but it does not change prediction. When the willpower is depleted, which in a demanding role it will be, and quickly, the prediction reasserts. The task is back where it was. Systems are valuable, but a system is a structural arrangement of tasks and time. It does not change what the brain predicts will happen. When you engage with a particular category of work, the Excuse me. The man who built a beautiful productivity system and still can't start the avoided thing is not failing at the system. The system is not built for the problem he actually has. Deadlines work by temporarily overriding the prediction with urgency. The cost of not starting has been raised high enough to outweigh the predicted cost of starting. This is effective in the short term, but is borrowed against future depletion. And it teaches the brain that urgency is required to begin, which means that without urgency, beginning feels harder, not easier. Over time, the man becomes less able to start without external pressure. He has not solved the problem. He's made himself dependent on the solution. Motivational content, listening to something inspiring, reading something energizing, and visualizing the outcome. These temporarily raise the emotional state and can produce a burst of initiative. But they do not touch the prediction model. The prediction is built from evidence, not from feeling. The burst fades. Accountability, telling someone else what you tend to do. This adds a cost, not starting. Rather than building prediction that starting is worthwhile, social accountability tends to erode over time, particularly when the accountant is not present, and the avoided task is sitting in front of you on a quiet Thursday afternoon. None of these solutions are useless. Some of them are useful in the right context, but none of them touch the mechanism. As long as the mechanism is unchanged, the pattern will reassert. What actually helps? What does change a prediction? Evidence. The prediction model is built from evidence and it changes through evidence. New, repeated, consistent evidence that starting is not also expensive, that engagement can lead to completion, that effort arrives at done. There are three key aspects. Not progress, not effort, completion. The brain's prediction model does not update on the basis of how hard you worked. It updates on the basis of whether you finished. This is why a day of intense effort that ends with 20 things still open often feels more depleting than a day of moderate effort that ends with several things genuinely done. Completion signals to the brain starting led to finishing. That is the evidence that matters, and it accumulates. Enough completions, consistently experienced, begin to shift what the brain predicts will happen when you initiate something. The impulse, when you've identified the thing you keep avoiding, is to act it directly, to sit down finally and force a start. This often fails because you attempt to change prediction without having changed the evidence yet. More reliable sequence is, before you attempt the thing that matters, close 2 or 3 small things deliberately, not because they are important, because you need to give the brain something to update against. Reply to the email that's been sitting there. Make the call you've been deferring. Finish the thing you started last week and left incomplete. Tick, tick, tick. The mind lightens slightly. The prediction shifts slightly. From that marginally wider position, the approach to the harder thing becomes more accessible. Not easy, but accessible. There's a piece of psychology here that is worth understanding because it explains why starting, even very briefly, has a power that is disproportionate to its size. In the 1920s, a Russian psychologist called Bluma Zaganik noticed something odd about waiters in a cafe. They could remember complex orders with remarkable accuracy, but only while those orders were still being served. The moment the order was complete and the table was cleared, the memory went with it. People were nearly twice as likely to remember tasks they had been interrupted in the middle of than tasks they had either finished or never started. Unfinished things stay live in the mind. Completed things are released. There's an interesting counterpoint here from more recent research. Gloria Marx found that in modern working environments, the average knowledge worker switches tasks every 47 seconds. Not because they cannot focus, but because the environment and their own habits interrupt them that frequently. The cost of each switch is not just the seconds lost. After an interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to return to the original task at full depth. So Zeigarnik tells us that unfinished things pull us back. Marx tells us that the modern environment interrupts so frequently that the pull rarely gets the chance to work. The desire to complete is present. The conditions for completion are constantly being destroyed. Once you have generally started something, and even 2 minutes of real engagement, not planning to start, not thinking about starting, but actually beginning, the brain shifts its relationship to that task. It is now something unfinished. The mind treats unfinished things differently. They pull. The desire to complete them activates. What was inert becomes live. Just start for 5 minutes is not a gimmick. It is working with a real mechanism. The difficulty is that the prediction cost of starting has to be low enough to allow the first 2 minutes to happen, which is why closing a few smaller loops first, reducing the predicted cost before approaching the harder task, is the more reliable sequence. If the space problem is significant, if the open loops have accumulated to the point where genuine cognitive room is hard to find, a different kind of work is needed first. Ask, what am I currently carrying? List it, get it out of the brain and onto paper. For each item, can I close this now? Can I give it enough structure to put it down temporarily? A specific next step, a named person, a date, so the brain stops tracking it. And hardest of all, do I actually need to be carrying this at all? That last question applied to a full list usually reveals that some significant portion of what a man is carrying is not his to carry. He picked it up somewhere along the way because it was there, or because no one else did, or because his sense of who he is requires him to be the person who holds things. Releasing it is not abandonment, it is a recognition that cognitive space is finite, and that protecting it is a form of leadership, not a failure of it. You now know why the brain withholds initiative. You know why motivation is a prediction, not a feeling. You know why the space problem matters as much as the time problem. You know what the thing that stays undone is often telling you, and you know what actually changes the pattern. But knowing and doing are two different things. Most men who attend a session like this leave with a clear picture of what is happening. What is hard is implementing it inside a working life that generated the problem in the first place. Let me bring this together. Procrastination, the way I've described it, is not a character flaw. It's not evidence of weakness. It's not poor discipline or lack of motivation or a failure of time management. It's a brain doing exactly what a well-functioning brain does, making accurate predictions based on available evidence and protecting resources accordingly. For some men, it is also brain protecting a model of who he is, keeping him away from the task that carries the highest identity stakes. The man who keeps not starting the thing on his list has often built that pattern across years of genuine, sustained effort. The brain learned from experience that starting is expensive, that starting opens more than it closes, and it made the rational calculation withhold the resource. Underneath that is often something else, a category of avoided tasks that has less to do with cognitive load and more to do with a quiet agreement, never consciously made, about what he is and is not allowed to pursue. The thing that is most his is often the thing that stays undone the longest, not because he does not want it, because the version of himself he has built over decades does not quite include it. Both layers respond to the same thing. Not more effort, not more discipline, evidence. Repeated experience that starting can lead to finishing. That completing something is possible, that the brain's current prediction is not permanent fact. It is a calculation built from evidence, and it can be updated by changing evidence. That is the work, and it is available to you. Not just the procrastination itself, but the wider pattern beneath it. I offer a small number of gifted sessions each year to men who want to explore this more directly. It's not a pitch, a conversation, enough time to see whether this is the right territory for you and whether I'm the right person to work with. Now I'll pop the link into the chat.